We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5 today, looking at the fourth part of our series, Putting a Hedge Around the Law. Jesus teaching us the new spiritual way to be able to satisfy the demands of the law. And we're going to start out Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42 is what we'll look at today. And I've entitled this, An Eye for an Eye. And the question is that barbaric or is that merciful? The eye for an eye law has been misunderstood for a long time. And so we're going to get down and draw some conclusions about the correct interpretation of this. So is it barbaric or is it merciful? Let's read our text for the morning, Matthew 5 and verse 38. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile with him, go with him 2. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Just a quick breakdown of this pericope. You ought to make a note to yourself that we're looking for an antithesis. The section that we're studying, Jesus gives antithesis. He tells you what the law said, and then he tells you what he expects of you. And so in this particular text, I want you to notice that verses 38 and the first half of 39 is the antithesis. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say, do not resist the one who is evil. I'd put a couple little marks after the word evil so that you recognize that's the antithesis. So that's part 1, the antithesis. Part 2 is the following verses, and what we have in those following verses are 3 examples of what Jesus is talking about. And so it's important that we realize that because it can be taken incorrectly what he meant when he says don't resist an evil person. It can be taken incorrectly if we don't understand that he is giving us the examples of exactly what he means when he says that, so that we don't take that too far. So he gives us 3 examples. They are demonstrations of the moral lesson that he wants us to learn in his new antithesis. So let's look at those first, guys. Let's look at the 3 practical examples that he gives us so we can develop the context of exactly what this verse is trying to say. I love this quote. Ben Witherington in a commentary said, a text that is out of context is just a pretext for whatever you want it to mean. So what is the context? And that's what these 3 examples are going to teach us. What kind of example is he talking about? So let's look at the first one. Verse 39, he says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. It's important to understand that what he's talking about here is the Jews had an understanding of what was clean and unclean. Now this, I'm just going to give you as best as I've made of this, but the left hand was considered unclean in the Jewish nation because think back in those days, you didn't really have the hygiene that we have nowadays. You didn't always have a way to keep everything clean and sanitary. So if there were unclean duties that you had to perform, sanitation, I won't go into details, but keeping your body clean, that was a function of the left hand. Now, if you're doing necessary things to keep your body clean with your left hand, you're not necessarily going to want to grab your food with that same hand and eat with that hand, so you would eat with the right hand. So in this primitive culture, the left hand was reserved for unclean things. The right hand was reserved for clean things, eating and so forth. And so what he's talking about here is a backhand to a person which was an insult. I don't want us to mistake the idea here that if someone's trying to mug you, if someone's trying to beat up on you, if someone is expressing violence towards you, that he's saying, yeah, just let it happen. That's not at all what he's saying. The reference here is a backhanded slap to the face, a slap to the cheek, and it was a common, I don't know if you'd call it an idiom, but it was an understanding there that that was an insult. That was a put down. That was someone from a higher social class making it known that they were the boss and you were the smaller one. So really, the context of this is an insult. A slap to the face would have been an insult. And he's saying, hey, if someone does that, just turn to him the other cheek because that presented a problem for the person that slapped you. Again, they couldn't slap you with the left hand because the left hand was unclean. So if you turned your cheek the other way, they would have to slap you with the open hand of the right hand. The insult was to be slapped with the back of the right hand. But if you turn your cheek, now the only thing they have left is to slap you again with the open hand. And they couldn't do that because that meant you were their equal. You see, the backhanded slap was the slap of humiliation, embarrassment, but an open hand slap was something that went on between equals. So there was a limitation there. If you were to turn your face, it was going to limit what this person could do. But he says, hey, it is good to be able to endure a backhand, to not want revenge, to not try to fight back. And he says, be that way. If you get slapped, if there is an insult that's being hurled at you, if somebody's trying to embarrass you or belittle you, he says, you got to learn to let that roll off your back. What's the saying, like water off of a duck's back? Is that a popular saying? You've got to be able to just let an insult just sort of roll off your back, not retaliate, not want vengeance. And this isn't the first time. This idea of being slapped, giving someone your cheek, to allow someone to insult you, that's Old Testament stuff as well. Turn to Lamentations chapter 3. I want you to see another example of this. In Lamentations chapter 3, Jeremiah is preparing the young men for going into exile in Babylon. And he's trying to prepare them that in Babylon, you're going to be embarrassed, you're going to be insulted. And he's going to explain to these young men, believe it or not, he's going to say to the young men, do you know that it's a good thing for you to be able to learn to tolerate an insult, to not fight back, to not want revenge? In fact, it's a good thing for you to learn to let men put a burden on you that you don't want, but for you to learn to muster yourself up, to carry yourself well, and carry that burden even though you don't want to. He said, these are good characteristics. It's not going to hurt you in the least. Let me read it to you. It starts out with a song that we're very familiar with, the steadfast love of the Lord. And he says, remind yourself, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. And we will put our hope in Him for that reason. So let's read it, verse 21. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. This is what gives me hope, he says. Verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, and His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is His faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness, the truthfulness and the faithfulness of God. Verse 24, the Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in Him. And He's given them that Him to say that's where our hope is. Our hope is that God is the one that comes to set the record straight. God is the one that comes to fix things. So it would be good for you to learn to endure in the meantime. He goes on in verse 25, the Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the soul who seeks Him. And here's our verse 26, it is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Verse 28, let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Put his mouth in the dust. That means don't say anything, don't cry out. There may yet be hope. Verse 30, let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults, for the Lord will not cast off forever. There is the idea to be able to tolerate insults, to be able to tolerate an insolent backhand. He says it's good for a young man to learn to let this roll off your back. Our hope is in the Lord. Our hope is in God. And he finishes by saying the Lord will not cast off forever. The Lord is not going to let this situation continue forever. So put your hope in the Lord and learn to let this stuff slide off your back. Learn to tolerate it without vengeance, without anger, without malice. And that is what Jesus is meaning when he says, when someone strikes your cheek, give him the other one to strike. He says, this is talking about insult, humiliation. But he promises that the Lord will not cast off forever. Put your hope in the Lord because he's the one that will eventually fix things for you. Completely different than tolerating violence or being mugged, being attacked. It's not the same as self-defense. It's learning to let insults roll off your back. Number two, he says, the second example he gives is if someone takes you to court. Verse 40, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, that was an outer garment, let him have your cloak as well. Now the cloak was the most important piece of clothing that a person had them. It's hard to imagine because we've got our nice, warm, cozy beds, and these beds have everything we need to keep warm. But in these days, in the evening, what you would use to keep warm was your cloak. It was so important that in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus says that it's only proper that when a soldier goes out to the field to replace another soldier, if the soldier that comes out to replace you doesn't have a cloak, then you need to give that soldier your cloak before you go back in, because you don't want that soldier to have no way to keep warm at night. So this idea of giving away your cloak was a very pivotal importance back then. People needed it to survive the night. And so his idea here, it seems strange. It's like, wow, if somebody's going to take your tunic, go ahead and give him your cloak as well. Seems strange. Now, what we call this is hyperbole. We know that this is hyperbole because if you gave someone your tunic and your cloak, you're going to be what? Absolutely naked. Now, God doesn't want His children to be exposing themselves in public, running around and naked, so we recognize this as being hyperbole. Jesus is saying, this is the degree that I want you to go towards. When someone's trying to embarrass you, humiliate you, you go the extra mile for that person. And there was a limitation. Here's what's important to understand about this verse. There was a limitation to what someone could take from you. If you're not aware of that, you might look at this and go, wow, somebody wants something of mine, I got to give them everything I have. I just got to roll over and be some kind of a milquetoast that just hands my possessions off to somebody. No, there was a limitation. When someone took an article of clothing as a pledge, God had already made a rule that they had to return that article of clothing to you before nighttime. Why is that? Because you need that article of clothing to stay warm through the night. So when He says, go ahead and give it to them, He knows full well that the Mosaic law requires that person to give it back to you before nighttime. Let me show you where the law says that. Turn to Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24, we'll look at roughly verses 10 through 13. The cloak was the common article that was taken when you owed someone money or when a promise had been made. It was kind of like collateral. But there were rules in that first century church about when you took someone's collateral, making sure that you gave it back to them before nighttime. Here we are, verse 10. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge, his collateral, his cloak. You should stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. Verse 12. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. He's talking about his cloak. Verse 13. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he can sleep in his own cloak. So again, to help us not misunderstand what the verse is saying, he's not saying to be a milquetoast and just hand over everything anybody wants. God knew that there was a limitation. The idea is waiting and hoping on God. Set your hope on God. So if you're embarrassed or insulted, but here plainly says, God says, go ahead, don't sweat it. Go ahead and give it to him. Why is that? Because God had demanded that that person return it to you before nightfall. Very different than the interpretation that some of us might have made of this. Let me give you the third example. The third example he's going to give, whoops, did I give you the quote? I didn't give you the quote. The third example in Matthew is if someone tells you to carry a load for a mile, go ahead and carry the load for 2 miles. That one's a little bit different. That one steps outside of the Jewish understanding. And what he's talking about there is something called the Angaria. The Angaria was a Roman law that gave a Roman soldier permission to make you help him carry something. But the permission was also limited. Just like the previous examples had limitations, the Angaria also had a limitation. A Roman soldier could only force you to go 1 mile. There was a limitation. So when Jesus said, go ahead and go with him 2, that was just his way of saying you need to rise above the insult. You need to be able to rise above the humiliation. Don't retaliate. Don't want vengeance. Don't be that kind of person. As a matter of fact, go an extra mile with the guy. Let me give you some information here about this Angaria, this Roman law. Here it is. The commonly invoked Roman law of Angaria allowed the Roman authority to demand that inhabitants of occupied territories carry messages and equipment the distance of 1 mile, 1 mile post. But it prohibited forcing an individual to go further than a single mile at the risk of suffering disciplinary actions. It was a compulsory duty. Do we remember when Jesus was carrying the cross and he fell under the weight of the cross? He couldn't carry it the whole way. And so a Roman soldier pressed a man. Was it a guy named Simon? The Roman soldier pressed a man and said, you carry his cross for him. That was the Angaria. They could force you to carry a burden for a mile, but notice there was a limitation placed on this. So all 3 examples, as best I can tell, all 3 examples that Jesus gives are examples that already had limitations placed on them. So in a sense, you were already safe from anything worse happening to you. And Jesus says, when these kinds of things happen, let it roll off your back. Don't seek vengeance. Don't get angry. Don't retaliate. That's not the kind of demeanor that you ought to have. And it was important that we explain these ways. These were all acts of intimidation, humiliation. But he says you've got to let that. It is good for a person to let that roll off your back. Be the bigger person. I wanted to explain those 3 examples because a misunderstanding has happened in many churches that these examples of turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, give him your coat as well, that these are all examples of pacifism. passivism, that you need to just be a milquetoast, that you just need to roll over, that you just need to let whatever happens, that you don't get to fight back. There's no, what do we call it? Self-protection? What's the word? There's no, when someone's attacking you, you fight back. What's that called? Self-defense. Thank you. Self-defense. Some people have turned this into no self-defense. There's you can't join the army. You can't be a soldier. You can't join the military. You can't own a weapon. You can never fight back. That these verses paint a picture of a milquetoast pacifist. And I hope that you've seen from the examples, every one of them was a limitation. Every one of them was an insult. And in an insult, God says you need to learn to just let that kind of thing roll off your back. I want to take a break from the sermon here, and I want to give you some important scriptures that talk to us about self-defense. Can a Christian defend themselves? If a man breaks into your house, are you supposed to just let him have his way with your children and your wife and your possessions? Or are you supposed to fight back and protect your household? So let me clarify some of these things with some verses. So we'll put a pause in the sermon here. And let's talk about self-defense quickly. I'm going to give you Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 and verse 35. It's important to understand Jesus is talking to His apostles, and He's letting His apostles know fundamentally, while I was with you on the earth, I bound Satan. He says you can't go in and steal a strong man's stuff unless you first do what? First, bind the strong man. So while Satan was on earth, while Jesus was on earth with His apostles, He had bound Satan so that His apostles were safe and protected, and nothing could happen to them. But now that Jesus is going to be crucified and resurrected to the heavens, He's now telling them, when I leave, my protection is also gone. And things are going to change radically for you guys. So you need to do things differently after I'm gone. Notice what He tells them they need to do differently. Verse 35, then Jesus asked them, when I sent you out without a purse or a bag or sandals, did you lack anything? And they said nothing. Now, however, He told them, the one with a purse should take it, and likewise a bag. And the one without a sword should sell his cloak and buy one. Verse 37, for I tell you that Scripture must be fulfilled in me. He was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. The fulfillment of what was supposed to happen to me is coming very soon. They're going to kill me and I'm going to have to leave. So you guys are not going to have the protection that you once had when I was with you. So from now on, keep your money bag with you, keep your purse with you, keep your clothes with you. Oh, and by the way, if you don't have a sword, you better go buy one. That's self-defense. Luke chapter 12, protecting your household and protecting your family. Jesus gives a parable and He says, this guy better do exactly what you would expect him to do. If a burglar breaks into his house, this guy better protect his family and his possessions. That's what you would expect. So He gives a parable, Luke chapter 12 and verse 39. But be sure of this. If the head of the house had known at what time the thief was coming, he would have been awake and alert, and he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. What about military service? Killing, using guns, using weapons. What about that? Well, we've got military soldiers that came to John the Baptist when they heard his preaching of repentance. These Roman soldiers came to John and said, what about me? What should I do if I want to be repentant? Look at what John tells them, Luke chapter 3. Notice he doesn't say, get rid of the sword. He doesn't say, quit your job. He doesn't say, quit being a tyrant. Notice what he tells them. Luke 3 and verse 14. Then some soldiers asked him, what should we do? And John says, do not take money by force or by false accusations. Be content with your pay. Do your job well and be happy with what you're getting paid. He didn't tell them to quit their job. As a matter of fact, when we read Romans 13, I don't think I gave it to you, but you need to read Romans 13. The whole purpose of the government, the military, the police, the judiciary system is for God's servants to execute the wrath of God on the lawbreakers. So God needs people in the military, in the police, to execute His wrath upon those people that are breaking the law. Another one was a centurion that came to Jesus. Centurion, it sounds like he had a servant or a child that was sick unto death. And the centurion, now keep in mind, this centurion, this guy, if I remember correctly, he's in charge of 100 soldiers. This guy is a top honcho. He's a big boss. A bunch of soldiers. And notice how impressed Jesus is with this centurion. Matthew chapter 8. The centurion answered, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. Because I myself am a man under authority. I have soldiers under me. I tell this one to go, and he goes. And to another one, come, and he comes. And I tell my servant to do something, and you can better believe that he does what I tell him to do. How does Jesus answer that? Verse 10, when Jesus heard this, he marveled, and he said to those following him, truly, I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. This Gentile Roman soldier is the guy you want to imitate. He understands how things work. He understands authority, and he is the one you want to imitate. Jesus goes on to say, Gentiles like this soldier are going to get into the kingdom of heaven before the children of God, meaning the Israelites. This guy was the guy to imitate. It doesn't sound like Jesus is opposed. All right, back to the sermon. What was the antithesis? We have the context. The context obviously is 3 examples. All 3 examples, as far as we can tell, had limitations on them already. So since there was already a limitation, the evil deed could only go so far. Jesus says, learn not to retaliate. Learn not to seek vengeance. Just let it roll off your back. So now that's the context. Context is important. A text out of context is just a pretext for whatever you want it to mean. So the context is if you're being insulted. Let's go back to our text now, and we'll look at the antithesis. The first half of it is in verse 38. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, I want to pause right there, and I want to ask you in your own mind, if you consider the law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is your understanding that that is something barbaric? That is something bloodthirsty? Or do you see that as something merciful? Hopefully we want to be clear before we get done with the sermon today. Is an eye for an eye barbaric or is it merciful? Primarily, it's been interpreted by most of the world as something barbaric. It's interpreted as barbaric because it's misunderstood. People will say that that is a bloodthirsty law, that is a savage law, there's no mercy in that's a merciless ideology, an eye for an eye. I want to walk you through why most people have understood this concept of an eye for an eye as merciless, bloodthirsty, and where the mistake has been made. So first of all, this guy right here has contributed to the misunderstanding of an eye for an eye. And most of the movies that are titled An Eye for an Eye, these types of movies do depict revenge. That's what the movie is based on, revenged. That person did something to me or my family, so it's an eye for an eye. I'm going to give back to that person at least as bad as what he did, and probably even worse than what he did. These types of movies are based on the idea of the individual getting revenge for something that was a wrong that was done to him. So if you think of it as the individual getting revenge, then you're right. If you think of eye for an eye as vigilante justice, then you're right. It is improper. It's not the correct interpretation of the phrase eye for an eye. Not just in the movies. The movies have depicted it wrong. Unfortunately, some famous world leaders have depicted it wrong as well. Gandhi is famous for saying an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. That's probably the most popular way you'll see an eye for an eye interpreted. If everybody went around poking out everybody's eye for somebody that offended them, everybody would be blind. Again, that's an incorrect understanding of what the law was about. Martin Luther King made the same mistake. I think he just copied Gandhi. If we do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, then we will be a blind, toothless nation. All of these are presupposing that the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law is about revenge, is about the Chuck Norris, Sylvester Stallone, Rambo type movies where an individual goes out to get vigilante justice. And that's not at all what the law of an eye for an eye is. Actually, the law of an eye for an eye is a merciful law. It's a law that was instituted by God's commandment. So let's look at it. It's in several places. I'm just going to give you one. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 18. Listen for the purpose of this eye for an eye law. It's in Deuteronomy 19. Let me give you the references in case you want them. Exodus 21:24. Leviticus 24:20, and then Deuteronomy 19:21. Let's look at this together. Verse 18, and the judges. You need to put a square around the word the judges. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness, you need to put a square around the word witness. This is a court scene. This is an attempt to bring vigilantes in a wild and crazed society under a form of law where the judge is the one that executes the sentences, not individual revenge. This is a courtroom scene of order, and he says, if the witness is a false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he meant to do to his brother. And here's the reason, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. In order to stop people from doing this kind of evil. Verse 20, and the rest, all the other people, shall hear and fear, and they shall never again commit such evil amongst you. So here's the law, verse 21. Your eye shall not pity. It should be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, bruise for bruise, and it goes on. Here is the important distinguishing marker from what God authorized to the incorrect interpretation that Chuck Norris and Sylvester Stallone have made of eye for an eye. This eye for an eye is not vigilante justice. This is, as a matter of fact, is a merciful way of stopping one clan of people from continually attacking another clan of people because of some evil deed that one of them did to the other one. This is stopping the community from going out and getting revenge. This is stopping the community from going out and seeking to equal the score, like the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? The Hatfields and the McCoys, when people try to settle the score on their own, the score never gets settled. One person always keeps upping the other person. And so what God established in the eye for an eye law is a judicial system where decisions get made by the court system, not by the individuals. And the court system is taught that you need to have a consequence that does not exceed the crime. It's a merciful law because you're stopping someone. Someone trips your daughter at school. Well, the worst you can do is trip the person that tripped the daughter. You don't get to go kill the person that tripped the daughter. So this was a merciful law to make sure that the punishment for the crime was not greater or in excess of the crime itself, and it was to be handled by the judges, the judiciary system. It took vengeance out of the hands of the citizens, and this law put it into the hands of the legislature. Notice it is said the judges are the ones that should inquire diligently. You know, this brings to mind another text you guys might remember. Do you remember that there was a text in the law that said, if anybody has a rebellious child, that you should take the child before the judges, and if the child cannot be controlled, that you should take it out, and if the judges deem necessary that the village should stone the child. Have you guys heard that law? Oh, wow. I assumed you knew it. It's in Old Testament. Now somebody would go, that's a bloodthirsty law. That's a horrible, horrible law to kill a kid because he's being disobedient. What you don't realize is that in those archaic times, parents were killing their children. When a parent had a child that was a girl, that was a female was born, they could throw it outside and just ignore it and let it die. When a child was rebellious, the parent could just beat the child to death. And so by creating a law that says you take a rebellious child before the judiciary, before the legislature, it was actually a merciful law because it took the power of killing out of the hands of the parent. Does that make sense? So it's actually protecting the child from a parent exhibiting too much wrath. Now, there is never a case, it would be good to know, there is never a case in the Bible where the legislature decided that the child needed to die. So these laws that have been misunderstood need to be understood in the sense that it was bringing order to a village of chaos is what these were doing. It's nothing new from the Bible. This is a law. There's a name for this law. I'm going to give it to you. First of all, long before Moses ever enacted this law of an eye for an eye, I thought I'd give you some history here. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, one of the wise kings of Babylon. 2200 BC, we found a stele that had all these written rules of Babylon. One of the rules of Babylon was an eye for an eye. But again, it was the judicial system. Notice why the king of Hammurabi said that he had to have these laws. To bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoer, so that the strong should not harm the weak. That's an important concept in this eye for an eye law. It was designed to stop the stronger people from harming the weaker people by creating a judicial system. This law, an eye for an eye, it's called the Lex Talionis. They say it's the oldest law in the world. Let me give you this quote here. The Lex Talionis. The Lex Talionis, the law tit for tat, so far from being savage and a bloodthirsty law, is in fact the beginning of mercy. Its original aim was definitely the limitation of vengeance. In the very earliest days, the vendetta and the blood feud were characteristic of tribal society. If a man of one tribe injured a man of another tribe, then at once all the members of the tribe of the injured man were out to get revenge on all the members of the tribe of the man who committed the injury. And the vengeance desired was nothing less than death. So the Lex Talionis, this law, eye for an eye, deliberately limited vengeance. Seen against this historical setting, this is not a savage law, but it is a law of mercy. when we talk about a law of vengeance, stopping people from exceeding the damage that they inflict on someone. Let me give you an example of Lamech. In fact, we just read about him in Genesis in our Sunday morning class. Lamech is the image of an evil man, but a powerful man. And look at how Lamech brags in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23. What is he bragging about? Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, "Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me. I have killed a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold." Do you hear the vengeance, the wrath, the anger in that man's voice? If you so much as, "I'm going to kill you, I will get my vengeance, I will do to you 70 times worse than what you do to me." And the rule of an eye for an eye limited that kind of vengeance. It was a law of mercy. So he said, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." By Jesus' day, it was no longer literally poking out someone's eye because somebody else's eye, or breaking someone's leg, because by Jesus' day, they had already figured out that things are not necessarily equal. One of Tina Turner's legs might not be the same as one of somebody else's legs. And so they had already figured out monetary values for damage. They were no longer doing the eye for an eye, but the concept was you need to pay an appropriate amount for the damage that you have done. And so in this idea of having to pay out, getting paid back for a wrong that was done to you, is the lesson that Jesus is teaching. Don't seek that out. Don't expect to get paid back the damages. He said, just learn to let stuff roll off your back when we're talking about insults. And so the antithesis is said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, don't resist the one who is evil." Now this verse might take a person back to go, see, I'm supposed to just let him do whatever. What's the context of the verse? The context is insult, humiliation, something that had a limitation, that Jesus was teaching them, go ahead and endure it. There's a little bit of a thing that you should understand. The word poneros, evil, the word is translated evil. There's no article with the word porneo, or paneros. Paneros. There's no article. When it says the evil person, the Greek scholars are saying more than likely it's not talking about an evil person, it's talking about an evil deed. And it's simply because there is no the person in the text, it's just the word evil. So more than likely they're saying, do not resist the evil. Just let it slide by, like the Lamentations was teaching the young men. It's okay to let someone slap you on the cheek and not retaliate. It's okay to let someone put an unfair burden on you and not retaliate. You can learn to let that slide. And so that's what that idea is here. Learn to let that slide. All the evils in the examples that Jesus gave had limitations to them. Insult, humiliation, and the idea was don't seek the monetary reward, don't seek the revenge, don't seek the vengeance. Well, I hope that's cleared up a little bit. Is eye for an eye barbaric, or is it merciful? It's merciful. Stops the whole world from taking matters into their own hands and puts it into the hands of the legislature. Now, all of that being said, I do want to close with an attitude of the Christian. This is not total, complete pacifism. We looked at that. But there is an attitude of the Christian that should go beyond the expectation of the world. I want to share it with you as we close. Isaiah chapter 50 gives us a picture of what Jesus was willing to endure in order to save souls. Isaiah 50 and verse 6, he says, "I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and from spitting. But the Lord God helps me. Therefore I have not been disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like flint. I'm going to tough it out, he said. And I know that I shall not be put to shame, because he who vindicates me is near. That's the proper attitude Christ had that we should have. He who vindicates me is near. I think it's in Romans chapter 12. He says, Romans chapter 12, towards the end, he says, do not seek vengeance, because vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And then in Romans 13, he goes on to say, God has established soldiers, policemen, military, to execute his wrath on lawbreakers. God has a way of dealing with it. And so like Jesus' attitude, he says, I'm going to trust myself to the one who vindicates me. All right, let me say a prayer and we'll close out today. Heavenly Father, what a lesson. It goes so counter to the human impulse to be wronged and to want to wrong back. Father, I pray that this message would change our hearts, change our souls, enlighten us to see that there is mercy in forgiveness. There is mercy in not retaliating. There is a law and order to your will, and we want to abide by that, Father, to be those types of people that learn how to let the little things slide off our back, but to not mistake that for being a milquetoast, a pacifist, because it's obvious from your text that you've wanted us to be lights in the world. And if the salt loses its saltiness, it's no good for anything anymore. It's obvious that you've wanted us to take a stand in the world so that people will recognize your truth. And at the same time, you've asked us to lend our cheek to the person who would slap it and to not retaliate against that person. Praise your holy name for your mercy and forgiveness, Father. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.